September 3rd, 1260. The morning sun rose over the springs of Ain Jalut in the Jezreel Valley, illuminating what would become the most consequential battlefield in medieval history. 35,000 Mongol warriors, the vanguard of an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, advanced with the casual confidence of men who had never known defeat. Behind them lay the smoldering ruins of Baghdad, Damascus, and Aleppo. Ahead stood 8,000 Mamluk cavalry, the last organized military force capable of resisting Mongol conquest. Within hours, the unstoppable would meet the immovable, and the fate of Islamic civilization would be decided by steel, strategy, and fate. Picture this nightmare from the perspective of anyone living in 1260. For 40 years, the Mongol Empire had expanded like a plague, consuming everything in its path. They had destroyed the Jin dynasty in China, annihilated the Khwarezmian Empire, crushed the armies of Russia and Eastern Europe at the Battle of Legnica. Everywhere they rode, cities burned, populations were massacred, and entire civilizations disappeared. The Mongols didn't just conquer, they erased. When they took Baghdad in 1258, they slaughtered between 200,000 and 1 million people, threw so many books into the Tigris River that chroniclers claimed the water ran black with ink for weeks. The mathematical reality facing Islam in September 1260 was terrifying. The Mongol Empire controlled more territory than any power in human history, over 24 million square kilometers. Their military system, perfected through generations of constant warfare, had proven superior to every opponent. Chinese infantry, Persian cavalry, European knights, all had fallen before Mongol tactics that combined mobility, discipline, and psychological warfare with devastating effectiveness. Against this apocalyptic threat stood the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, led by Sultan Saif ad-Din Qutuz. The Mamluks themselves represented one of history's most remarkable military institutions. Slave soldiers purchased as children, converted to Islam, and trained from youth in nothing but warfare. By the time a Mamluk warrior reached adulthood, he possessed skills that made European knights seem like clumsy amateurs. These men could shoot arrows with lethal accuracy, while riding at full gallop, execute complex cavalry maneuvers with parade ground precision, and fight in close combat with weapons ranging from bows to swords to maces. But even Mamluk excellence seemed inadequate against Mongol numbers and reputation. Qutuz could muster perhaps 20,000 total troops from Egypt and allied Syrian territories. Most importantly, he faced an enemy whose psychological advantage was as powerful as their tactical capability. The Mongols had cultivated terror with calculated brutality. Cities that resisted faced total annihilation. Populations that surrendered might survive with reduced casualties. This policy of exemplary violence had broken the will of countless opponents before battles even began. Here's what makes Qutuz's decision to fight rather than negotiate truly extraordinary. He had every rational reason to avoid confrontation. Several of his own emirs counseled accommodation. Perhaps becoming Mongol vassals would preserve some Egyptian autonomy. The Crusader states, still clinging to coastal footholds in the Levant, had already reached agreements with Mongol commanders. Even some Muslim territories had submitted rather than face destruction. The precedent for survival through submission existed and seemed far wiser than suicidal resistance. But Qutuz understood something that transcended tactical calculation. If Egypt fell, Islam would effectively cease to exist as a major civilization. Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, all the holy sites would fall under pagan Mongol control. The religion of over 100 million believers would be reduced to scattered communities without political power or cultural coherence. The choice wasn't between resistance and survival. It was between fighting and accepting civilizational extinction. The Sultan's first strategic decision demonstrated the kind of bold thinking that separates legendary commanders from competent administrators. Rather than waiting in Egypt's fortifications for the Mongols to approach, Qutuz marched north to meet them in Palestine. This aggressive deployment served multiple purposes. It showed Muslim populations that resistance remained possible, preventing the psychological collapse that Mongol reputation encouraged. It allowed Qutuz to choose the battlefield rather than having terrain dictated by enemy movement. Most critically, it forced a decisive engagement before Mongol reinforcements could arrive from their campaigns in Anatolia. The Memluk army that departed Cairo in July 1260 represented the concentrated military excellence of Islamic Egypt. 8,000 cavalry formed the core, not conscripted peasants or feudal levies, but professional warriors, whose entire lives had prepared them for exactly this moment. Each man rode an Arabian horse bred for endurance and speed. Each carried weapons crafted by Damascus's finest armorsmiths. Composite bows whose range exceeded Mongol equivalents, curved scimitars whose steel could cut through mail, lances whose points could punch through any armor. But Qutuz's most important strategic asset wasn't equipment or training. It was his second-in-command, a Memluk general named Baybars al-Bundukdari. At 40 years old, Baybars had already established himself as one of Islam's most brilliant tactical minds. Born in the Caucasus, sold into slavery as a child, trained as a Memluk warrior, he had risen through pure military competence to command position. More importantly, Baybars possessed the kind of creative strategic thinking that allowed him to analyze enemy strengths and develop counters that transformed advantages into vulnerability. As the Memluk army marched north through Palestine in late August, Baybars studied Mongol tactics with scholarly intensity. He recognized that Mongol military doctrine, while devastatingly effective, followed predictable patterns refined through decades of success. They preferred to engage enemies in open terrain, where their superior horsemanship provided maximum advantage. They used feigned retreats to draw opponents into pursuit, then wheeled and destroyed scattered formations with concentrated archery. They relied on psychological dominance. Enemies who believed themselves already defeated fought with hesitation that made prophecy self-fulfilling. The terrain around Ain Jalut, the springs of Goliath, where David's legendary victory had occurred centuries earlier, offered possibilities that Baybars recognized with tactical genius. The Jezreel Valley appeared to be perfect Mongol ground, open terrain, where their cavalry could maneuver freely. But the valley was actually bounded by hills that could conceal forces and create natural ambush positions. If the Memluks could lure Mongol forces into the valley floor, hidden reserves positioned on surrounding heights could attack from elevation with devastating advantage. The Mongol army approaching Ain Jalut on September 3rd was commanded by Kidbuka, an Nestorian Christian who had served Mongol Khans with absolute loyalty for decades. His 35,000 warriors represented a smaller force than the hordes that had conquered China or Russia, but they were veterans of the recent campaigns that had crushed Syria and Iraq. These men had seen Muslim armies crumble before them from Aleppo to Baghdad. They approached the coming engagement with the casual confidence of predators who had never encountered effective prey. Kit Buka's intelligence about Memluk forces was dangerously incomplete. His scouts reported 8,000 cavalry, accurate numbers, but fundamentally misunderstanding what those 8,000 represented. Mongol commanders assumed that Muslim cavalry would fight like the Syrian and Iraqi forces they had recently defeated. Courageous perhaps, but tactically inferior and prone to breaking under sustained pressure. The concept that these Egyptians might possess training and discipline, matching or exceeding Mongol standards, simply didn't register in Kit Buka's strategic calculations. The battle began at approximately 9 a.m. when Mongol advance scouts made contact with Baybars leading the Memluk vanguard. What happened next would be dissected by military historians for centuries as one of the most perfectly executed tactical deceptions in medieval warfare. Baybars, commanding roughly 2,000 cavalry, engaged the Mongol scouts with volleys of arrows, then executed what appeared to be a panicked retreat toward the valley floor. The fleeing Mamluks maintained just enough distance to stay ahead of pursuing Mongols while appearing disordered enough to suggest genuine rout rather than calculated withdrawal. Kit Buka, watching from his command position, saw exactly what Mongol doctrine trained him to expect: Muslim cavalry breaking under pressure from superior Mongol warriors. He committed his main force to pursuit, certain that destroying this vanguard would shatter Mamluk morale and make the subsequent campaign against Egypt a mere formality. 35,000 Mongol cavalry thundered into the Jezreel Valley, their composite bows ready, their confidence absolute. But here's what Kit Buka couldn't see from his position. Those fleeing Mamluks, under Baybars's command, were executing one of the most disciplined tactical maneuvers in military history, a feigned retreat that required perfect timing, absolute unit cohesion, and nerves of steel. Medieval cavalry charges are inherently chaotic, maintaining formation while appearing to flee in panic, while actually withdrawing at precisely calculated speed to keep pursuers engaged without allowing them to close to melee range, demanded training that only Mamluk discipline made possible. Meanwhile, on the hills flanking the valley, 6,000 Mamluk cavalry waited in concealed positions, with patience that would have been impossible for less disciplined troops. Sultan Qutuz himself commanded the main reserve, watching Baybars draw the Mongol army deeper into the killing zone. The Sultan understood that timing was everything. Spring the trap too early, and Mongols could withdraw. Too late, and Baybars's vanguard would be destroyed. The decision of when to commit forces would determine whether Islam survived. At approximately 10:30 a.m., when Mongol pursuit had extended deep into the valley with flanks exposed and reserves committed, Qutuz raised the green banner of Islam and signaled general attack. What happened in the next 30 seconds transformed battlefield dynamics with devastating suddenness. 6,000 Mamluk cavalry erupted from concealed positions on both sides of the valley simultaneously, charging downhill at Mongol flanks that had no defensive formations prepared. The psychological impact on Mongol forces was immediate and catastrophic. Warriors who had spent decades as predators suddenly found themselves prey. The fleeing Muslims they had pursued wheeled with parade ground precision and counterattacked. The empty hills they had barely noticed suddenly spawned thousands of cavalry bearing down on them with lances and drawn swords. Most devastating of all, they faced opponents whose riding skills and archery matched their own, something no Mongol army had encountered since their conquests of the Khwarezmian Empire decades earlier. The battle that followed wasn't one engagement, but dozens of simultaneous combats across the valley floor, each demonstrating different aspects of Mamluk tactical superiority. Where Mongol cavalry attempted to form defensive circles, their standard response to unexpected attacks, they found themselves targeted by Mamluk archery that matched Mongol accuracy while being delivered from superior positions on elevated terrain. Where Mongols tried their traditional feigned retreats, they discovered that Mamluks recognized the tactic and refused to break formation in pursuit. The close-quarters fighting revealed advantages that Mamluk training provided even against history's most feared warriors. Mongol tactics relied heavily on archery and light cavalry maneuvers, designed to avoid prolonged melee. Mamluk warriors, conversely, trained extensively in close combat with multiple weapons. When formations closed to sword range, Mamluk scimitars and superior armor gave them decisive edges. Mongol lamellar armor, excellent against arrows, proved less effective against curved blades, designed to find gaps between plates. But the deepest significance of Ain Jalut went beyond tactical superiority. The Mamluks fought with psychological advantages that Mongol reputation had consistently denied to other opponents. These Egyptian warriors didn't fear Mongol invincibility, because they understood that reputation rested on victories against opponents who believed themselves already defeated. Mamluk training had instilled absolute confidence in their own capabilities. More importantly, they fought with religious conviction that made death in battle against pagan invaders a path to paradise rather than a fate to be avoided. By noon, Mongol formations had begun fragmenting under pressure that violated everything their doctrine assumed about enemy capabilities. Kitbuka, recognizing that his army faced not inferior opponents but matching or superior warriors, attempted to organize withdrawal to more defensible terrain. But Mamluk cavalry, operating with coordination that only professional military systems could produce, had already closed escape routes. The valley that had seemed like perfect ground for Mongol cavalry warfare had become a trap from which extraction proved impossible. The fighting reached its climax when Sultan Qutuz led his personal guard in a charge against Mongol command positions, where Kitbuka attempted to rally his forces. The clash between Qutuz and Kitbuka became the symbolic confrontation of the entire battle. Islam's desperate defense against pagan conquest distilled into single combat between commanders. When Kitbuka fell, killed by Mamluk warriors who overwhelmed his bodyguard, Mongol morale shattered completely. What followed was pursuit and slaughter that lasted until darkness made further combat impossible. Mongol cavalry, legendary for their ability to disengage and escape from unfavorable battles, found themselves harried by Mamluk forces, whose horses possessed equal stamina and whose warriors showed no mercy to invaders who had massacred millions. The casualty count told a story that shocked the medieval world. 15,000 Mongol dead carpeted the Jezreel Valley. Nearly half of Kitbuka's army had been annihilated. Mamluk casualties numbered fewer than 2,000. But the true significance of Ain Jalut transcended battlefield statistics. The battle represented the first decisive defeat inflicted on a major Mongol army since the empire's founding. It shattered the aura of invincibility that had been Mongols' most powerful weapon. Muslim populations from Egypt to Central Asia, watching to see whether resistance was possible or suicidal, received proof that the unstoppable could be stopped through superior strategy and unwavering commitment. The strategic consequences cascaded across the next decades, with mathematical precision. The Mongol advance into Africa and the Middle East ended permanently at Ain Jalut. Future Mongol attempts to conquer Mamluk territories repeatedly failed against defensive systems. Refined from lessons learned in September, the Ilkhanate, the Mongol successor state in Persia, eventually converted to Islam rather than destroying it, recognizing that military conquest had reached its limit. For the Mamluk Sultanate, victory transformed Egypt from desperate defender into regional superpower. Within months, Qutuz would be assassinated by Baibars in a political coup that brought the battle's tactical genius to supreme command. Baibars' subsequent reign established Mamluk Egypt as the dominant Islamic power for 2 centuries, controlling territory from Egypt through Syria and maintaining independence against both Mongols and Crusaders through military excellence, institutionalized at Ain Jalut. The psychological impact on both Islamic and Mongol civilizations proved equally profound. Muslims across the world had watched Baghdad's destruction and Damascus's fall with horror that approached despair. Ain Jalut demonstrated that Islamic military power could not only resist, but defeat existential threats when properly organized and led. The victory became embedded in Muslim consciousness as proof that faith combined with competence could cook any odds. Mongol strategic thinking underwent equally significant revision. The empire that had conquered from the Pacific to Eastern Europe learned that universal dominion had limits. Future Mongol expansion focused on consolidating existing territories rather than pursuing unlimited conquest. The psychological advantage that terror had provided diminished, as populations recognized that Mongol armies, however formidable, remained vulnerable to opponents who refused intimidation and fought with superior strategy. Modern military analysis of Ain Jalut reveals principles that remain relevant in contemporary warfare. Baibars' integration of intelligence, terrain exploitation, disciplined execution, and psychological warfare demonstrated that numerical inferiority means nothing when tactical superiority is absolute. The battle proved that even enemies with legendary reputations can be defeated through commanders who analyze their doctrine, identify vulnerabilities, and execute plans that transform enemy strengths into exploitable weaknesses. Individual moments of courage throughout the battle deserve remembrance across the centuries, separating us from those desperate hours. Mamluk warriors who held positions against overwhelming initial attacks, while Baibars executed his feigned retreat. Mongol soldiers who fought with professional competence even when recognizing their tactical situation had become hopeless. Sultan Qutuz's personal leadership at the critical moment when commitment of reserves determined victory or catastrophic defeat. The deeper legacy of Ain Jalut resonates through 8 centuries of subsequent history. The battle marked the high water mark of Mongol expansion westward, the moment when the greatest empire in human history discovered its limit. It preserved Islamic civilization as a political and cultural force that would survive into modernity. It demonstrated that military genius could emerge from any culture and overcome any advantage when strategy perfected through desperate necessity met opportunity created by enemy overconfidence. September 3, 1260. The morning sun that rose over confident Mongol cavalry set over the corpses of 15,000 warriors who had believed themselves invincible. 8,000 Mamluk defenders had faced 35,000 conquerors and achieved victory so complete that chroniclers struggled to describe it without resorting to divine intervention. But the truth was simpler and more devastating than miracle. Superior strategy, perfect execution, and absolute faith had combined to prove that the greatest threat to civilization could be stopped by soldiers who understood that some things, religion, culture, civilization itself, were worth defending at any cost. In the springs of Ain Jalut, where David had slain Goliath in ancient legend, the Mamluks had proven that the legend's lesson remained eternally true. Size means nothing against precision. Numbers mean nothing against strategy. Reputation means nothing against warriors who refuse to be intimidated. The unstoppable Mongol horde had met 8,000 men who would not stop, and learned that will, properly directed, through tactical brilliance, trumps every numerical advantage that arithmetic can calculate.